Have you ever had a dream that didn't end when you woke up? You dreamed that you're in love with somebody. One day, you have no opinion of them. And then, you have this dream that you're in love with them. And you wake up the next day, and you see them, and you feel funny. Or maybe, you dream the apocalypse. 2 days before a nuclear war, mass confusion reigns. You are chased. You run all the way to the edge of a cliff, with certain death before you and eternal damnation behind you. You take a step over the edge. If those two dreams could have a sound, it would be that of My Bloody Valentines Isn't Anything, an album that is capable of simultaneously soundtracking our most ethereal dreams and our most violent nightmares. Isn't Anything was the moment everything changed, as what was once a jangly C86 guitar act from Ireland birthed the sound that would inspire your next favorite band in their sleep.
They're the bands who turn up in 10 years, 12 years' time with Richard Skinner or somebody doing a kind of, the My Bloody Valentine story, episode 12, The Difficult Years.
Welcome to the second episode of the My Bloody Valentine saga, where we go back in time to the very beginning of the story of the band that changed rock music forever to figure out just how they did it. Before shoegaze, before goth, before noise, and before post-punk, there was plain old punk. With its shameless shocking antics, noise pandemonium gigs, and strikingly simple song structure, punk music inspired a generation to reinvent music through frequency and shock. And it led a young Kevin Shields to find his calling in its anthems of chaos. Kevin Shields was born in New York, the oldest of 5 children to Irish parents who took the family back to Ireland when he was 10. While in Long Island he was an outsider, in Ireland he came to be known as the American kid on the block, and in an attempt to reconnect to his roots, changed his personality and accent. He fell in love with glam rock's otherworldly androgyny and dazzling musical production, taking notes from the noise generation, and then punk rock. At the age of 16, Kevin saw the Ramones play live and ended up deaf for 2 days after the gig. He was astounded by how loud they sounded, and he wanted to be too. He taught himself how to play random Barry chords through the neck of his guitar. After a 12-year-old kid said he wanted to make a band, he was suddenly intrigued. But Barry chords and Irish street gang shenanigans were all he wanted to do, until he met Colin Cusack. Colin was a young drummer who went to Catholic school but found more excitement in his connection with Kevin Shields than nuns and books, which resulted in the formation of their first band, The Complex, who played a mixture of oi punk and classic punk. Together, they discovered bands, went to gigs, and even conducted interviews for their fanzine with Billy Childish of the Milkshakes. The original vocalist of The Complex was Liam O'Moynley, who went to school with Colin and who later became a member of the Hothouse Flowers of I Can See Clearly Now fame. They rehearsed every Sunday, playing cover versions of Sex Pistols and Ramones songs, doing what all the nerds and weirdos actually did as opposed to the cool people in the leather jackets. When Liam left, the two of them reformed his life in a day, switching their influences to post-punk, determined not to do anything that wasn't totally original. They wanted their act to be along the lines of the Butthole Surfers, using tapes to make total noise that would offend people, which culminated in an impromptu guerrilla avant noise performance at a mall on a Sunday afternoon that was only slightly shocking to the family audience, to say the least. In 1983, Colin and Kevin met a new eccentric singer, Dave Conway, and started making music as a three-piece, heavily inspired by the gloomy flavor of The Birthday Party and The Cramps. Dave's most influential contribution remains his renaming of the band to My Bloody Valentine after the 1981 Canadian/horror remake, immediately rejecting other previous names like the Burning Peacocks. They became a concept band of all sorts, amused by the idea of composing sweet-sounding pop songs that sugar-coated lyrical horror and sending them hurtling up the charts. But the concept was hard to grasp. They didn't find success in Ireland and used their connection to Gavin Friday of the Virgin Prunes to find gigs in Holland and Berlin, working with Wayne Norris, the manager of the Primitives. Squatting in Amsterdam, they lived at a dive called The Last Waterhole, operated by Hells Angels bikers, but quickly went broke. Eventually, Kevin found a job working on a farm, cleaning out cows and cowsheds, but it still didn't manage to get him a visa. 3 months later, they moved to Germany. In Berlin, they lived in a band community called The Cab, but after getting in an altercation with the band's serious drinking, they were forced to live at a youth hostel instead. They picked the city because experimental non-commercial bands were having significant mainstream success. In 1985, they put out This Is Your Bloody Valentine, a Cramps record with a psychobilly/goth feel and 60s surf atmospheres. They made no money from it, as they weren't allowed to listen to the master tapes until they were pressed, but Kevin's backing vocals and Colm's distinct drumming were already establishing themselves as an important part of the Valentine sound. In March, the band recorded their first and so far only live album, The Man You Love to Hate, live, as part of the Amigo Records The Equal Music Festival. It only sold 100 copies. Feeling they'd become overly reliant on other people to support them and longing for independence, they headed back to London in the spring of 1985. Tina Durkin, Dave's girlfriend, had been helping them with keyboards, but she was a novice at best. So when she left after their comeback to the UK, it was time for a change. Debbie Gooch had been recommended to them to play bass by a friend of the band in Berlin, who was also her ex-girlfriend. She was in a poor financial situation at the time and had to be in unemployment benefits for a while, as in the 80s the government waged a war of attrition against Bohemian dole culture. She had been involved in the late 70s anarcho-punk Somerset scene, playing in an all-girl band called Bikini Mutants. According to Debbie, even after her audition, they never actually said that she was in the band. They just kept arranging practices and she kept going along.
Yeah, you've been around long enough, you might as well stay.
In December, the band released The Geeky P, which had a noisier Jesus and Mary Chain inspired sound, but Kevin later called it a failure that misrepresented My Bloody Valentine's efforts. He was so frustrated with the slowness of his success that he contemplated disbanding and joining his family back in New York. In a last-ditch effort, in 1986, they redefined their sound and released the new record by My Bloody Valentine after listening to a few C86 cassettes out on NME. It was a bizarre, jangly indie-pop affair that attempted to provoke listeners. They were now an inoffensive, 60s-looking band with bowl cuts, playing oddly twee music that was very loud, noisy, and disconnected. Along with the incestuous single Sunny Sunday Smile, these became the last releases to feature David Conway, who left to write science fiction and horror novels. Kevin had realized that he was something the band was not, and that he would have been just as happy to run around with his shirt off screaming. The band contemplated splitting and reforming once again after putting out an unsuccessful ad searching for a Smiths-inspired singer, but they had no idea that the person who would come in would become the secret to their newfound dreamy synergy. Belinda Butcher was a girl from Derbyshire with timeless interests. She went to college, took dance classes, and had an obsession with the 1920s and Northern Soul. After dropping out due to a kidney condition, she worked as a nanny for a French family and mothered a son at the young age of 21 with a French ex, with whom she moved to Paris for half a year, and who later recommended her to audition for a band called My Bloody Valentine, after he'd met their drummer on a ferry coming in from Holland. She sung Dolly Parton's Bargain Store a cappella, instantly becoming Debbie's favorite, and joined the band along with another potential vocalist who didn't wind up staying for long, leaving Kevin to have to teach her how to play guitar. In 1987, they agreed to record an EP and mini LP out on Lazy Records, who had been pressuring them into finalizing an album, after Kevin purchased a 12-string guitar and became enamored with its softer, jangly sound. But it wasn't enough to save the band from getting their first questionable reviews. After only 2 months of practicing together, they finally released the 2 EPs, Strawberry Wine and Ecstasy. The original cut of Ecstasy was lost, so despite the band bringing in an independent engineer to redo it, the sound was doomed and doled out, and was deleted after a single pressing of 2,000 copies. Critics and fans still fail to appreciate the evil lyrics and ear-damaging frequency behind the pretty song titles. The joke hadn't worked, and the band became bored with the idea of writing sappy ironic pop, finding anything they recorded before this period hard to listen to, making everyone who heard them ask themselves, can My Bloody Valentine, four tender urchins from Ireland, move from shy indie status to so possessed and blessed a racket? Thankfully, something made them realize. In early 1988, Dick Green, an executive head of Creation Records, bailed Kevin out of a fight, and the two of them got acquainted, eventually introducing his band to eccentric CEO Alan McGee. Noticing a striking sonic resemblance between the sounds of the Valentines and Husker Du, McGee offered them the opportunity to record a single. The result was the You Made Me Realize EP, produced at a cheap rundown studio in East London in less than a week. For the first time, Kevin felt like he could properly experiment with actual studio equipment and effects. His biggest effort in the record, the song Thorn, was the first to employ the signature tremolo arm glide of a Fender Jazzmaster guitar. But it was You Made Me Realize that changed the destiny of the band forever through an iconic explosion of noise. While the song Studio Noise interlude is only 30 seconds long, Kevin and Colin were adamant to turn it into a transcendental 130 decibel live experience. Inspired by an incident that took place the year prior during a student gig, where they insisted on playing the loudest chord progression possible to annoy a couple of kids playing pool into actually paying attention to the music. Except it took 30 minutes to work. Colm and Kevin began playing the loud noise for their own pleasure, to get transported into another dimension by some kind of crazy drug. They wanted the noise to cause physical change in people, a release of endorphins triggered by imminent danger. And the audience was indeed quick to react. It transformed them into one giant organism. Everyone was in their own head, unable to talk to each other. At every gig, the band vowed to keep going until the crowd changed and reacted physically to the brutally psychedelic, shimmering, hallucinatory quality of the notes that seemed to dance atop the noise.
And for the first 3 minutes, it's like, oh, okay, this is kind of cool. Then you're like, this is really too much. Like, I wish they'd fucking stop. And then about the 7th minute, it actually became kind of funny. And then about 10 minutes in, you start actually getting into it.
The goal was to lose all sense of time, finding sound and rhythm through sensory deprivation by being forced to be in the moment, awakening to elation, and hearing a secret symphony inside a huge noise with so much texture to it that people could imagine anything. Some heard slowed down riffs of existing music, others heard singing in a cloud of harmonics that wasn't really there, and all of a sudden, nothing became something, and that something was Isn't Anything. The band began recording their first proper debut LP in Wales, at a studio in the countryside, a barn near a military base, and the seclusion of a prolonged noise dream was quick to channel the paranormal. One evening, during the recording of the song All I Need, local cows awakened to a particular affinity to the tremolo noise hypnosis, and 20 or 30 of them surrounded the studio, as Kevin kept playing louder and louder.
The cows were like, we like this. What is this? We like this. And kind of paid homage to what was happening. They were like, yes, as representatives of nature, the cows went, good,
After that, the studio seemed haunted by cow sprites. Images of things with big almond-shaped eyes would come to Kevin when he was falling asleep trying to write lyrics. To release the tension, he would play pranks pretending to be a ghost of Dave Anderson, the engineer and owner of the studio who had been in Amandu, whose extreme reactions only encouraged him more. On the last day, he told the band that the reason he got so unsettled was because the studio was actually haunted, and he didn't want to scare them. Suddenly, Kevin rethought his cow-sprited visitations as well as a number of other bizarre incidents caused by sleep deprivation, like hallucinations at night where he'd seen angels, lights, and animal ghosts. According to Belinda, he fell asleep in a bath for hours and nearly got hypothermia. She was also experiencing interesting dreams and out-of-body experiences, floating around the ceiling of Kevin's room, seeing him in his bed and trying to grab him so that she could come down. Well, he'd actually been at the laundrette all along. This inspired her lyrics for Cupid Come, along with birthday party guitarist Roland Howard's Seed of Love. And during the recording of No More Sorry, Belinda's voice seemed to magically disappear every time they'd play the track back. She recorded repeated takes for hours until they realized it was just a blunder caused by a stoned Dave Anderson and not an actual curse. More assorted memories from this period included her riding a motorcycle and rescuing a sheep that had a prolapse as the Royal British Air Force fighter planes flew by. After Wales, they got more time in a tiny basement studio to complete the remaining tracks. When they finally got the bass sound to work, a speaker fell off the shelf, breaking the foot of one of the engineers who tried to stop it from happening. Somehow, the band liked the sinister, surreal atmosphere more than they would any future recording session. To get to the mindset required to navigate the near extreme of consciousness, Kevin would stay awake long enough to reach a hypnagogic state, functioning on 2 to 3 hours of sleep a night, in a mood of surreal dislocation. Perhaps this is why the whole album evokes a dreamlike state. The compositions all verge on those moments where psychoses give way to hallucinations, surrendering to the feeling and the experience of the moment and what it intuitively does. As blurred and ambiguous as its overexposed cover photo, the Valentines' first Metamorphosis album resonated with threatening revolutionary sonic invention, in spite of its muffled production and 2-hour mastering time. It foregrounds feedback as texture, with hard-edged swooning sounds, and weird, time-slowing tricks, like bending detuned barré chords in and out of tune, using chord structures with open strings, different weird tunings, and the abuse of effects in unconventional ways. Most songs forego actual hooks or melody lines from anything other than the vocals, and are purposely raw, played as they would have live, with no extra bits or vocal double tracking to sound nicer. In fact, the band originally had a no comping vocals from different takes rule, which stipulated that everything had to be a single take, although they ended up breaking it quite often to make the lyrics sound even more seductive. Kevin had been so used to the melodies that the vocals became just another sound, and he couldn't tolerate hearing them clearly anymore. Belinda imitated Kevin's backup vocal style, singing in a lower register while he sang in a higher one. The result was sensual androgyny. All music was composed by Kevin, except for Sue Is Fine, which saw Colum's contribution, and the lyrics, which were a shared effort between the two of them and Belinda. Kevin and Belinda began dating in the late 80s, and a lot of their relationship was captured in the songs of the record, with sensual, impressionistic flair. A sleepy language that was incoherent but not any less real, unfocused but honed into something tangible. Despite all the narcotic comparisons, making love was the Valentines' ultimate drug of choice, a delirium take on physical romance. They attempted to portray the feelings that ordinary people had, in the language they might have used as a kaleidoscopic layer of abstraction, where there's total chaos going on, because those entertaining extremes are what is at the heart of a love song. Kevin said that that's also why their songs haven't got too many clever bits in them, because it meant you have to think too much about it. In 1989, Creation pushed for the release of When You Wake You're Still in a Dream to follow Feed Me With Your Kiss as a single, but the band refused. Surprisingly, Lazy Records recuperated the pressings of their old EPs and released them in a joint compilation as Ecstasy and Wine, which upset Kevin, as he saw them attempting to capitalize off of their Isn't Anything success, with fans thinking it was a new record, a significant dip in quality. He asked a Primal Scream roadie and 14 other armed guys to join him, and they raided the Lazy Studios to get 10,000 copies of the compilation back. He assured the executive in the office that if they left him alone, they wouldn't be coming back ever again, and kept their promise. Isn't Anything was released in 1988, and in some ways it became even more accessible than Loveless because you've probably heard its intangible touch in the dozens and dozens of other bands who borrowed from it to create what would have become the shoegazing sound. Kevin commented, "We had that term tagged to us and it seemed slightly derogatory. It was partly because a lot of the people in those bands used to go see us in the younger days. Then they all formed bands. But what they had all in common was chorus and flanger pedals. That wasn't what we were doing. It was weird being linked to something that was, in many ways, the exact opposite of what we were about." And the unsettling pressure was taken even further by the time the Loveless revolution happened, as we saw in episode 1, making the stakes of a future release record high. And it was inevitable that following it, all was going to come crashing down.
We had no energy, do you know what I mean, and no momentum.
Nobody's sort of big enough to kind of control it in a way.
It just imploded. We just kind of went a little crazy in ourselves.
I got possessed by something, and then it kind of made me do everything for a while.
We had a psychedelic meltdown.
We were completely dysfunctional as a band, as people.
Join us for the third and final installment of the story, where we dive into the aftermath of a 20-year absence, recent resurrection, and mysterious return with MBV and its implications. Thank you for watching. We hope you'll subscribe to the channel for more content. We'll see you soon for more stories behind the music.